Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Peter Dickinson with the Atlantic Council, who's in Kyiv, Ukraine, wrote an article last week that I found really quite interesting, and I thought I should reach out to him and have him elaborate on it. The title was "Putin is on an historic mission and will not stop until he is finally defeated." And Peter, welcome to the show. You took a sort of a wider view than just Ukraine in this article, and you wrote, in recent weeks, more and more Western leaders have become publicly warning that their countries may soon become targets of Russian aggression. The latest leader to sound the alarm was French President Emmanuel Macron, who stated on February 26 that Russia could attack NATO member states in the next few years. Macron also sparked a heated debate by refusing to rule out sending Western troops into Ukraine. You know, you and I have spoken a couple of times about the war in Ukraine and the invasion and the need for Western military assistance. But this seems like a far wider concern that you've got now.
Yes, absolutely. I think it's crucial for international audiences to understand where Putin is coming from and where he's going, where this could lead to. The invasion of Ukraine, when it began and before it began, was seen as a kind of was seen in sort of local terms. Russia had concerns about Russian-speaking Ukrainians. They were concerned about NATO's expansion into Ukraine. These were the narratives that we were fed in the lead up to the invasion and during the initial part of the invasion. Since as the invasion has progressed, now Russia's rhetoric has changed quite strikingly, and now they are more and more openly talking about the complete conquest of Ukraine, or the conquest of large parts of Ukraine, and referring very openly to the return of historically Russian lands. Putin speaks in sort of messianic terms. He talks about this as a quest, or as a sort of crusade to right the historical injustices of Russia's retreat from empire over the last 3 decades. Now, of course, if we talk about returning Russian lands, the Russian Empire, at its greatest extent, was far wider than Russia is today, and it goes far beyond Ukraine itself. So you immediately then have a long list of other countries who are just as much as targets as Ukraine was, in terms of the rationale, this sort of imperialistic rationale that Putin is now using. So we're talking about Finland, the Baltic states, Poland, Belarus, Moldova, the countries of the South Caucasus, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, the whole of Central Asia, and to take it to its fullest extent, even Alaska. So the Russia's potential to expand this war is very, very great, and the longer it goes on, and the more confident Russia becomes, the more open they are about their objectives. So it is a wake-up call for the international community.
So this isn't USSR. This is Peter the Great.
Tsarist Russia. Yeah, essentially Tsarist Russia. And Putin has said on a number of occasions that the Soviet Union was the Russian Empire under another name. He's explicitly stated that is his belief. Because the Soviet Union positioned itself as a union of Soviet republics, of Russia being just one of them. But even during the Soviet period, of course, many people in the West perceived the Soviet Union to be Russia. It was routinely referred to as Russia, and still is in many cases. And that is Putin's view as well. Putin openly says, and I say many times has reiterated this in public, the Soviet Union was the Russian Empire. The Russian Empire, at its greatest extent, was bigger than the Soviet Union. And these are the very clear, I think, boundaries of his ambition. You could argue that they go even further, and perhaps the most maximalist interpretation would probably also include the Soviet vassal states or satellite states of the Cold War, so going right up to East Germany. But certainly any country that was part of the Russian Empire would be very much in Putin's sights now as a target for potential further expansion.
There's large parts of the Republican Party in the United States that just don't believe that. And, you've got a current candidate for president of the United States, the former president of the United States, that thinks that he could stop the war in with one phone call in one day. What would you say to those people?
Well, I mean, I'm not sure that they don't believe it. I mean, perhaps some don't believe it. I think a lot of them more are indifferent. They think, well, what does it matter to us? But perhaps I'm splitting hairs there. But certainly in terms of Trump's position, now we'll have to wait and see what Trump's final position is. He is known, you know, as all politicians do, but particularly perhaps Trump, to grandstand and to make bold, wild statements while on the campaign trail. So we'll have to see how that would translate into the realities of government if he does return to the White House. But based on his conversations that as we heard them from the Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban a week or so ago after he met with Trump in Florida, Trump's plan to end the war is essentially just to abandon Ukraine. So essentially, he's not talking about ending the war in terms of a negotiated settlement. He's talking about ending the war in a Russian victory, which of course would be a catastrophe for the Ukrainian people, for the Ukrainian nation. It would also be disastrous for the entire democratic world and arguably for the planet in general. You know, the amount of you know, the level of risk there in terms of emboldening Putin himself, of sending a signal to other autocratic regimes that aggressive foreign policies pay dividends, that they can succeed, that you can claim other land, and that the West will essentially roll over and accept that, would be absolutely disastrous for the wider world, for international security. So you know, the signals coming from the Trump camp at the moment are, you know, I cannot overstate how dangerous they are in terms of international stability and international security.
But I think what they are believing, and you know, I don't know either, but I think what they're believing is if they withdrew funding, that they could effectively give to Putin what he's got, the territories that he's got in the Donbass, and Putin wouldn't go further. That he would accept that that victory of those provinces, those parts of Ukraine that he thinks you know, are Russian speaking, were always part of Russia, and he would stop there. You don't think that that's a reasonable belief?
No, absolutely not. Putin has said openly that he considers far more of Ukraine than he currently occupies to be Russian. And his definition of what is Russian continues to expand as his armies advance. So it is a very reasonable assumption to believe that he believes all Ukraine is Russian. Certainly the city of Kiev is, in Russia's own national story, the mother city of all Russians. So if the Donbass is Russian, if Crimea is Russian, if Odessa is Russian, as Putin has openly said, then it's almost doubtless that he considers Kiev to be the most Russian of all cities. So there's one obvious flaw in that argument. Putin himself said this week in an interview, it's absurd for me to talk about any negotiations with Ukraine just because Ukraine's running out of ammunition. Those were his exact words. He basically rejected any talk of negotiations on the basis of Ukraine being without ammunition. So there's a direct rebuttal to these Republican or the MAGA arguments right there from Putin himself. He said that essentially, if a future Trump White House or the Republican Party disarms Ukraine, abandons Ukraine, Putin will not be interested in negotiation. On the contrary, he will go further. And he's saying that himself now. So there's really no credibility to these claims that we are hearing from certain parts of the Republican Party that is a viable peace plan. It wouldn't mean the end of the war. It would mean the end of Ukraine.
In your article, you said that Putin has asserted that no Ukraine ever existed in history of mankind. The history of mankind, Ukraine never existed.
Yeah, I mean, he says these things more and more. I mean, he's always been very dismissive of Ukrainian statehood. He's always been very insistent that Ukrainians are Russians. I mean, he's been saying that going back for more than a decade. That is, I think, his sincere belief. He holds to that belief, and that belief is rooted in Russian imperial sort of orthodoxy. That is one of their core beliefs going back centuries. When the Russian Empire gradually overtook and subjugated Ukraine, beginning at the time of Peter the Great and actually his father, and then onwards through Catherine the Great's reign and then the subsequent Tsars. And they consistently attempted to erase Ukrainian identity, to ban the Ukrainian language, to ban any expressions of Ukrainian national identity, and to suppress the idea of Ukraine as a separate state. And on the contrary, they promoted this idea that Ukraine was a part of Russia, a core part of Russia, not just a fringe part, but an absolute, part of the Russian heartlands. So Putin's not he's not reinventing the wheel here, as it were. This has been around for centuries, but he seems to genuinely believe this. And his take on history is more or less a copy and paste from the old 19th century Tsarist histories. I mean, it's really old school stuff. It's wild, totally unacademical, ahistorical nonsense. Basically, he writes about Ukraine and Russia, just cherry picking various facts and ignoring this idea that Ukraine has been fighting against Russian imperialism for centuries. Ukraine's national hero, Taras Shevchenko, is a man who is seen as the bard of Ukraine. He's seen as the man one of the founders of the Ukraine as a modern literary language. He was writing in the mid-19th century, and he was consistently writing about Russian imperial oppression of Ukraine. And then Putin turns around and says, well, there was no Ukraine. So you've got this man who wrote reams and reams of material about this struggle against the Russian Empire by the Ukrainian nation. And Putin simply just whitewashes it and said, well, there was no Ukraine. The Ukraine didn't exist. So it's really pretty absurd stuff. But Putin is also counting on the fact that Westerners know nothing about Ukraine. So they're inclined to perhaps, give credibility to some of this nonsense.
And you're worried that people are paying attention or not paying attention. The people are paying attention to Putin and not attention to the Ukrainian situation.
Well, certainly yes, in general. But I think the historical narratives that Putin tries to promote actually fall flat to international audiences. I think that actually that's a mistake on Putin's part to try and push that. And in the past, he hasn't pushed that. I think it speaks volumes of how confident he's feeling now. In fact, that when he had his very high-profile interview with Tucker Carlson in February, which was really, his big moment to make his pitch to justify the war to international audiences, because it was clear this was going to have a massive, massive global audience, and especially in America and in the West. So this was really this was a key moment in the information war on the information front for Putin. Now, he used that interview. It was a very interesting interview. I don't know if you had the opportunity to watch it, but Tucker Carlson began the interview by very clearly trying to steer Putin towards blaming NATO and the West for the war. I mean, that was literally his leading question. He led in with that, and it was very clear immediately that Tucker Carlson's agenda was to use the interview to blame the West, to invite Putin to blame the West and to change the narrative around the war. Putin brushed it off, and instead he launched into like a half-an-hour narrative, this historical lecture about why Ukraine is Russia and why Russia has every right to subjugate and to basically erase Ukraine. Now I found that pretty remarkable. I think the logical argument that would be to have gone with the NATO position, because that resonates with international audiences. That resonates with audiences who are suspicious or skeptical or opposed to American influence around the world, who believe that NATO has gone too far, who believe that the West is provocative and has become too dominant in global affairs. So the NATO argument has always resonated quite well with a certain contingent, a certain constituency internationally. But Putin brushed it off, and they say he went on this historical narrative. So he's clearly feeling so confident now that he wants to make the big pitch and say, we're actually going to take over Ukraine. This is not about NATO. This is not about Russian security. This is about historical justice and historical justice of reclaiming Russian lands. Now, I don't think that sells well internationally, because if foreigners are kind of bemused by that, and again, even Tucker Carlson, who is the leading pro-Kremlin commentator in the Western world, in my opinion, even he was bemused by this and said openly, like, I don't know what it's about. He thought it was a ploy. He thought it was some sort of an attempt to distract attention. He basically was very critical of it, and he said he was annoyed by it. I think that speaks volumes. That this doesn't resonate with foreign audiences, because the implications are so grave of different countries saying we're going to start invading our neighbors because we have some historical claims to them. And B, it just kind of sounds really unhinged and really weird. Like nobody does that, and no one's done that for hundreds of years in the Western world. So I think that, you say, I mean, am I concerned people are paying attention to that? Actually, I think it's actually quite useful that international audiences hear Putin make these historical speeches, because he does sound unhinged, and because it is unhinged. And they understand that that's what this war is all about. This is not about some sort of legitimate Russian security concerns, or, overreach by the West, or any of these, more rational justifications. This is about Russia returning to a pretty nakedly imperial act of aggression, and pursuing an Putin's imperial ambitions. So actually, although obviously Putin's not looking to, that's not the result Putin's looking to achieve. I think he is actually, by making these pretty wild historical statements, he is actually waking people up to that reality.
We're chatting tonight with Peter Dickinson. He is a person with the Atlantic Council. He's written numerous articles about what's going on in Ukraine, Eastern Europe, the Russian invasion. He's living and working in Kyiv, Ukraine right now. We've had the privilege of interviewing him a few times, and he's recently read this article about Putin and his almost recreation, or attempt to recreate Peter the Great, Russian imperial. It's kind of scary. Very scary. Stay with us, everyone. We'll be back in 2 minutes.
Okay.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. The topic tonight is Ukraine and Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, and some of the comments he's made of late that would suggest, according to Peter Dickinson, our guest from the Atlantic Council, that that Russia has a right to not only Ukraine, but to numerous other countries. That Putin is trying to recreate the imperial Russia from the Tsarist era. And Peter, you were saying that this actually works to Putin's disadvantage, because it might wake people up to the imperialistic aggression that Putin is interested in. You mentioned in your article that some people in the West have actually spoken out, and the president of France being one, but still not a lot. And so tell me what you think the West's response has been, and what the West's response should be to this new sort of point of talking from Putin.
Well, I mean, I think you're right to say that it's, the response has been not enough. I think certainly that would be the very succinct way of putting it. I think the initial response was one of shock and resolve. The West came together very quickly and very, fast, more strongly than I think Russia had anticipated. And initially, the very first moment of the war, I think there was a sense of there was an expectation that Ukraine would collapse. There was a widespread belief amongst most Western intelligence agencies, as far as we're aware, and certainly in the public statements that were made, and certain comments behind closed doors that have since entered the public domain, that Ukraine would collapse within days, that it really had very little chance of resisting Russia. But then, once it became clear, within a week or so, that Ukraine was going to fight this, and Ukraine has actually had a chance of achieving success on the battlefield of some degree of resisting, the attitude changed in the West, and by after the first month, Ukraine won the Battle of Kiev essentially without Western aid. They received very small amounts of Western aid, essentially the sort of weaponry, the sort of handheld weaponry that you would use in a partisan sort of guerrilla war once you'd already been occupied. A handheld over shoulder sort of rocket launchers, things of that nature. So they won the Battle of Kiev without any Western aid, essentially, which was a major victory, because Russia had sent tens of thousands of its very best troops, of its best military units, to seize Kiev during the first days of the war. That was the priority goal of the war. That was supposed to be their blitzkrieg, the killer blow to the Ukrainian government, the Ukrainian state, essentially. And they lost that battle. And so after the first month, Russia withdrew from northern Ukraine, sort of licking its wounds, and retreated. And at that point, the West started to think, okay, actually, Ukraine can win this one. Ukraine can at least certainly survive as a state, and push the Russians back. So then we saw the West supplying Ukraine with increasing amounts of weaponry. However, It's never been enough. Every single stage of this military support from the West has been preceded by a very long debate and very frustrating sort of hesitation and delays and uncertainty and concern. And then they've delivered often, inadequate quantities of weaponry. So it's never been enough. The West has never made a decision up until this point that Ukraine needs to win the war. The goal of the Western support up until this point has largely been, can be legitimately characterized as Ukraine must be given enough not to be defeated, and for Russia not to win, but not for Ukraine to win and for Russia to lose, which is really where we need to be. So it's been better than nothing. Certainly, it's been quite impressive in many respects because people didn't, if we look at what the Western response was to Georgia in 2008 when Russia invaded, if we look at the Western response to the Russian invasion of Crimea and eastern Ukraine in 2014, what we saw since 2022 is on a totally different level. It's much, much more. So I don't want to be totally dismissive of it and say, they've failed. They haven't failed. They've done a lot, but it's not nearly enough. And it's been governed by this idea, I think, and this is the crucial thing, I think, a very, very crippling sort of self-defeating fear of escalation, that the West is terrified of escalating this war. And by that, what the West means, certainly, is they're terrified that the war will move beyond the boundaries of Ukraine and become a much broader European war. And that fear of escalation has basically been a self-deterrent. It's deterred the West themselves and prevented them from giving Ukraine what it needs. And what the end result of that is actually this fear of provoking Putin has provoked him more and has made him go further and has encouraged him. And now he's feeling very confident because he sees the West is intimidated. He sees the West is scared. He sees they're afraid. And we see this with his nuclear rhetoric, his nuclear blackmail. Every time he feels that the West is becoming bolder or the West is becoming stronger. In recent months, we've seen the French sort of rallying round and saying, okay, Europe has to stand, saying we might send troops to Ukraine. And what do the Russians do? We've seen 2 times in the last few weeks of Putin saying very publicly, I will use nuclear weapons. Be careful. Using nuclear blackmail because he knows that immediately scares the West and especially the Germans, but not only the Germans. A lot of Westerners, they're immediately terrified and immediately an internal debate starts in the West. They say, oh, is this wise? Should we do this? And the hesitancy starts again and the boldness and the resolution to act decreases. So Putin plays on this very well, but that's, I think, the fundamental thing if we want to understand the Western response. It's been okay, it's been better than we expected, but it's been very badly hampered by this fear of escalation, which essentially plays into Russia's hands.
So what do you think of the French president's, comments that there might be NATO troops in Ukraine and effectively suggesting that there's more of an effort from NATO in the West that is needed, and or frankly, the Nikki Haley, the candidate for the Republican primary nomination that backed out recently, where she was, some people thought, a warmonger, that she was a hawk, that she was, talking about how critically important it was to arm Ukraine, support Ukraine. Otherwise, there would be American soldiers on the ground in Eastern Europe in the future. But she lost. So what do you think about those few and far between voices that are arguing for more of a NATO presence in Ukraine?
Well, I think at this stage, Ukraine's not calling for NATO troops, and it never has called for NATO troops. I think what Emmanuel Macron is doing here is he's saying to Putin, you don't draw the red lines, we draw the red lines. And if you listen to what Emmanuel Macron says, he's actually been very, very smart. He's saying, we have been limiting ourselves. We've been saying to Putin, we're confronted by a dictator here, an aggressive, expansionist dictator, and we're telling him what we won't do. Now, that's madness. And I think that's a legitimately very strong point. He's saying, it's strategically nonsense to tell someone who is a strategic adversary, who is an aggressor, who's a threat, telling them what you won't do in advance to signal that. And he's now saying nothing's off the table. And he's not saying we're sending troops to Ukraine. He's not saying we should prepare to send troops to Ukraine. He's saying we don't rule out sending troops to Ukraine. So he's basically taking the red line away and saying, let's let Russia worry about what we might do instead of us worrying about what Russia might do. So I think that's a very wise strategic point. He's actually going against this idea of fear of escalation. He's saying, let Russia have the fear of escalation. Let's us regain the initiative in terms of escalation. That's what Macron is doing here. He's not saying like we're sending troops tomorrow or we should prepare to send troops now. He's saying we might, and we don't rule it out, because we're the ones who should have we should have the escalation advantage. We're the more powerful of the adversaries here, and our interests are directly at stake. So we don't want to rule anything out. That's stupid, and we won't do that. So, Macron's position, I think, is quite strategically wise, and it's certainly a departure from what we've seen over the last few years. And he's also driven by what he's seeing in America. Europeans at the moment are horrified by what they're seeing in America. They are legitimately terrified. And it's been a very sobering experience for them. For the first time, I think, it's certainly in a generation, they are starting to think, we can't rely on America. Now, there's been a lot of incidents over the years of questions, and during Trump's first presidency, of course, we heard a lot about the need for Europe to pay its way, the need for Europe to not rely on America, to sort of not freeload off America. And they're all legitimate concerns. But we've never had a situation like now where the candidate for the presidency of America openly says, I would encourage Russia. I would say to Putin, do what the hell you want. And we would not defend countries if they failed to meet some sort of, annual defense spending levels as established by NATO. NATO is not a protection racket. NATO is not some sort of a mafia scam to shake down countries for security. And so, this is absolutely outrageous rhetoric coming from the Trump camp, and it terrifies people.
It is outrageous, but there is a historical, maybe not a complete, completely comparable context, but there is a historical comparable, which is the 1930s, right? And during that time period, as Hitler was gaining in strength, there was, not only in the United States, but in the United Kingdom, an effort for appeasement and isolationism. And certainly in the United States, isolationism, where people thought that FDR would lose the election in the late 1930s if he supported Britain. France, was against Hitler to a greater extent than he was. And, we had Lend-Lease, where we could give arms, but we had to charge money for it, and we would loan them. And it wasn't until and unless Pearl Harbor that the U.S. really became non-isolationist and got involved. So what do you think of that analogy of number one, the appeasement that didn't work, and number two, the isolationism and indifference in the United States with large swaths of the American population until they were personally attacked?
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right to draw that parallel. There are clear parallels there. There are clear echoes of appeasement, of 1930s appeasement in what we're seeing with Putin. In fact, shockingly close parallels. It's really, history very rarely aligns as closely as what we've seen of the rise of Putin's dictatorship. And his war against Ukraine over the last 10 years, and the rise of Hitler in the 1930s. The parallels are astounding. The rhetoric, the fallen empire, and then the new Führer arising. This is Putin in the early 2000s after the fall of the Soviet Union. This is Hitler in the 1930s after the fall of the German Empire. The lost war, the First World War, the Cold War. The rhetoric about making Germany great again, about making Russia great again, the wars, the campaigns and wars of aggression against neighbors to reclaim historically German land, the Sudetenland, Czech Republic, Austria, and then the Danzig corridor, and ultimately eventually leading to World War II. And then we see with Russia, we see Crimea, East Ukraine, and the whole of Ukraine. The parallels are really, pretty obvious and pretty chilling. And in terms of the Western response, again, you see the same thing. You see this appeasement sense, this sense of like, let's not get involved. Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister, being very dismissive of the Sudeten crisis in 1938 and saying this is a quarrel between peoples in faraway lands. about whom we know nothing. That's the attitude of a lot of people in the West towards Ukraine and Russia, that we don't know about these people, they're a long way away. It doesn't concern us. These things are very are very clear, these parallels, and it's I say it is very striking. But having said all that, I think it's important to underline, if you look at the polling data coming out of the West, and specifically about it from America, the polling data clearly indicates that a majority of Americans are not isolationist on this issue. They do recognize that America's interests are in preventing Russia from winning the war in Ukraine, from supporting Ukraine, from allowing Ukraine to fight back. That's quite clear. I think even most polls indicate that more Republicans than not do favor continued support for Ukraine, and certainly if we bring independents and Democrat voters into that picture, that it's a clear majority in virtually every poll that I've seen. And the same is true in Congress. Now we have this bill for Ukrainian support in Congress blocked basically by Donald Trump. But there's no doubt, there's no question, as far as I'm aware, that if that bill is brought to the floor, it will pass resoundingly, it will pass easily. So while there is isolationism, we are seeing sort of echoes of 1930s appeasement, and that is, that's pretty scary stuff. We shouldn't lose sight of the fact that there is still majority support, public opinion, and within the political establishment, within Congress itself, for support for Ukraine. Now, and actually, the American position is the Trump position at the moment, which itself is scary because he's not even been re-elected yet.
Not even being re-elected yet, not even formally the candidate, and he seems to be controlling enough of the Republican Party that they've controlled Congress and the money is not flowing. And so therefore, while you say that the people might actually support Ukraine and NATO efforts in regards to arming Ukraine, it's not happening. And the election's still a long way off. And there's still the fear that Trump might actually win. Anyway, this is an incredible situation that we're in. And I think, and maybe after the break, we can go back to this. You talked about the first couple of weeks of the invasion. I think the even more interesting thing that maybe I'd like to talk about is the couple of weeks before the invasion, where I think similarly, people were living in a dream world that Putin would never actually cross the border. Anyway, I'm going to ask you about that in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes with Peter Dickinson of the Atlantic Council, coming to us today from Kiev, Ukraine. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. It's a real interesting. I don't think it's a pleasure because actually, Peter, I'd rather not be speaking to you because I wish we didn't have this topic that we were dealing with. But given that we've got this topic, it is a pleasure to speak with you because you're so knowledgeable about what's going on. You write about it on a very frequent basis. You post about it every day, and it's your job. And it's incredible that you are in Kyiv, writing for the Atlantic Council and experiencing what's going on a day in and day out basis. I got to ask you though. I interviewed a Canadian Eastern European expert in, I think it was February of 2022. Marcus Kolga is his name, very smart guy. And he was warning that Putin was serious and that the troops were being amassed at the borders. When most people were saying, "Oh, Putin's he's not that dumb. He'll never cross the border. He'll never actually, attack Ukraine." And I think the majority of people actually didn't think that Russia, that Putin would be so stupid as to start, an invasion. And yet he did. Go back to, the attitude in the month before, when was it? February 22nd, 2022, I believe, or something like that. What do you think the world's attitude was? And is that similar today, that we just don't believe he can be as stupid as he is?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, it is amazing. I mean, hindsight is a hell of a drug, I mean, when you have hindsight, of course, things appear obvious. I mean, I would say, if we look back to that month, I mean, I would say even a couple of months before the invasion began, it was the first day of the invasion was February the 24th, 2022. So, the first 2 months of the year, essentially, I think, when we saw this build-up going on. There was a perception. I mean, I think I would rather, if I may, just first talk about the perception in Ukraine itself, because I think there was also widespread skepticism within Ukraine that this would happen. And now there's a lot of people saying, "Oh, the government knew, they should have told us, we weren't prepared." But I don't actually buy into that. I think that there was widespread skepticism that we were going to see a full-scale invasion, and I think it's important to understand why. These people are not fools, and they certainly have a very clear idea of what the Putin regime is all about and what it's capable of. And the perception was not like they wouldn't do it because it was a bad thing to do in terms of, morally or ethically or politically. It was just seen as a foolish thing to do because it wouldn't work or it would have very negative consequences. But I think the most important thing, if we look at it certainly from the Ukrainian point of view, to remember is that we'd seen almost the same thing happen the previous year. In the spring of 2021, so almost exactly a year before the full-scale invasion began, Putin did the same thing. They amassed troops all around the border. They held them there for a couple of months. It was very publicly visible. They kept building up and building up and building up, and there was a lot of speculation that we may see a major invasion. And then they withdrew. And so when they started doing it again at the end of the year and in early 2022, a lot of people thought, okay, again, he's bluffing again. He's trying to get some sort of concessions. He's trying to do something, because we'd just seen the same thing done before. Now, of course, what we know now is that what we'd seen in 2021 was a dress rehearsal. They were practicing the invasion. And 2022 was the real thing. But at the time, there was a perception like that Putin was just trying to bluff because, again, we need to look at the context here. Putin was seen to be running out of options. His goal has always been, since he became president, has always been the subjugation of Ukraine. And that goes back to the very early years of his presidency. If you go back to the beginning of his reign in the early 2000s, he tried to take over Ukraine in 2004 by putting his guy in the presidency with the 2004 Ukrainian presidential election. They tried to rig the elections and put Putin's guy in the presidency. Now, Ukrainians rebelled against that, and that was the Orange Revolution. Millions of Ukrainians came onto the streets. They were able to overturn the election and to re-vote and have a free and fair vote, which, of course, the Russian candidate didn't win. So that was the sort of founding moment. That was the origin story of Putin's war against Ukraine. So for 20 years from then to now, we've seen this campaign escalate more and more. Again, he finally did get his guy in the presidency in 2010 when they tried to reunite with Russia in 2014 or rejected ties with Europe. Again, the Ukrainian people rebelled. We have the Euromaidan revolution. When that was successful, and again, the Russian guy was kicked out, Putin that time invaded, went into Crimea, went into East Ukraine. Then we had an 8-year period where the Russians were essentially trying to use these two sort of platforms, the Crimea and East Ukraine, to destabilize the rest of Ukraine and to draw the rest of Ukraine back into the Russian sphere. Now, by 2021-22, it was clear that that wasn't going to work, that Ukraine was moving more and more and more away from Russia towards the West. So there was a sense from the Russian perspective that time was running out and that they were losing their grip on Ukraine in a historic sense, in a definitive sense, that Ukraine was moving into the Western orbit irreversibly. And Putin was facing what would be, a catastrophic defeat for Russia. The loss of Ukraine would be absolutely catastrophic for Russia's international interests and their sense of self. So he was seen as desperate, certainly. So when the build-up was happening in 2022, Putin was seen as a desperate man, but he was also seen as a man who was bluffing because he'd done this bluff the year before. So there was a perception in Ukraine that probably he might do something in East Ukraine, but very few people that I spoke to, at least, really thought that he would launch a full-scale invasion. It just seemed too outrageous and too wild a risk, and frankly too foolish from a political point of view. So there was very little expectation that this would happen right up until it did. And of course, now after the fact, everybody says, we all knew, look at all the signs. But the thing is with a bluff is that a bluff has to look realistic, otherwise it doesn't work. So all the signs that we now say, it was obvious, at the time we thought that those who were watching it thought that they were actually the Russians creating this impression of a planned invasion in order to gain some sort of concessions from the West, because Putin was desperate.
And so the analogy or corollary or learnings from that would be what? I think that it would be that Putin plays the long game, that he's patient, that he'll bluff a few times, and that the West will say, "Oh, well, he'll never attack the Baltics. He'll never go beyond Ukraine," and he'll bluff a few times, and say, "I'm going to recreate Tsarist Russia," and not do it. And so we'll say, "Well, that was just talk. He doesn't actually mean it." But then, not right away, but in a year, 2, 3, 4, 5, 8 years, 10 years, 20 years, you were talking about from 2004 to 2024. It could still happen. Is that the learning that I should take from it?
Absolutely. I mean, if he is, the big danger the West has, and I think still has, they're still in denial about the nature of the Putin regime. The nature of modern Russia. The fact that these are, these issues that we talk about imperialism and imperial ambitions, they are shocking to Western audiences. They are not shocking to Russian audiences. They are day-to-day, everyday ideas within the Russian information space. You hear people on Russian television casually talking about the Baltic states as being not real countries, as being Russian countries. Casually talking about, referring to Poland as well. Of course, it was Russian for centuries. Warsaw is a Russian city. Moldova, all these countries that I've mentioned, all the countries of the former Russian Empire. The Russians casually discuss them as Russian, as they were, previously Russian, and potentially to return to Russia, so to speak. These are not, in any sense, controversial ideas within Russia itself to Russian audiences. They're only controversial to international audiences because we have such a limited understanding of what Russia is and how Russia sees itself, how Russia self-identifies as an empire. So, yeah, absolutely. I think your parallel, your conclusions are accurate here. And again, I would draw the parallel with Hitler. We look back on Hitler and we say, why did no one stop him? And people point to Mein Kampf and they say, look, the guy wrote a book. He wrote a book saying, I'm going to kill the Jews. I'm going to expand to the east. I'm going to take over, the Lebensraum in the east. I'm going to take over all these countries to into the Soviet Union and Ukraine. That was his plan. And he wrote a book, an entire book, a best-selling book about it. Made it compulsory reading for the German people, and then we still acted surprised, like, oh my God, well, maybe he won't go any further. And to us now, looking back, that seems, crazy. That seems absurd. But we're actually doing exactly the same thing now with Putin, because he also has written essays saying these things, saying, I'm reclaiming Russian historic lands. There is no Ukraine. He's written about this. He's written whole essays about this. He's made, endless speeches about this. This is no secret. The media, the propaganda that he and his regime very tightly controls, every day talks about this stuff. Every day. It's been normalized. Expansionist imperialism is normalized. Genocidal anti-Ukrainian rhetoric is normalized. Denial of the statehood of a whole list of countries that were part of the Russian Empire is normalized. All these things are part of the routine, everyday Russian information space. And we need to start taking it seriously. We need to start taking it at face value. If someone shows you who they are like that, you need to accept that this is the reality and not say, well, maybe they're just engaging in some sort of performative politics here. They mean it.
Well, I think we've made that mistake with Hitler. I think we're making that mistake with Putin, but I think we've made the mistake over and over again with people. When they say what they're going to do, sometimes you got to believe what they're actually saying. Anyway, we're going to take a final break, and come back with some concluding comments. I'm going to ask Peter about where we actually are right now with this war in Ukraine. We're going to widen it to sort of a current picture for a quick conclusion, if we could. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I've been chatting tonight with Peter Dickinson of the Atlantic Council. He's written about Putin recently, and that's what we've been chatting about. But Peter, just for our closing couple of minutes, I wonder if you can widen. You've also written about and or posted other articles that have been written in the Atlantic Council papers about what's going on in the Black Sea, attacks in the south, and attacks in the east, and Russia advances on villages. Maybe give us a picture of some of the other things that are happening right now in the Russian invasion of Ukraine, if you could.
Yeah, sure. Well, so at the moment, the frontline situation is that Ukraine is running out of ammunition, or is very short of ammunition. They're suffering from shortages across the board, which are a direct result of the delays in America's, the deadlock in America regarding US military aid for Ukraine. So that's already being very, very acutely felt on the front lines. The Ukrainian forces are having to ration their ammunition, and Russia is advancing at a number of points. But these advances are very small. We're not talking about major breakthroughs or leaps and bounds. The only significant advance of the last year that Russia has made has been the capture of the town of Avdiivka, which is a town with a pre-war population of around 30,000. So, and that was around I think less than 10 kilometers from the starting position Russia was in 2022. So, we've got to keep a sense of perspective here. We're not talking about war-winning advances taking place, but we are talking about Russia moving forward for the first time in a long time, and that advance, these advances are taking place because Ukraine is being left sort of hanging in the wind by the American lack of military support. And now, if that continues, of course, Ukraine's position is expected to worsen. So we are looking at a potentially much more serious position on the front lines in the next few months, certainly going into summer 2024, which is traditionally the campaigning season. The ground is hard. This is when the armies will attempt to make breakthroughs and move forward. If Ukraine is left with dwindling supplies until the summer of 2024, Russia will surely look to make some major breakthroughs that could be war-winning breakthroughs. They'll look to claim significantly more land. So at the moment, the frontline position certainly favors Russia, and we see that reflected in Russia's rhetoric, in Putin's rhetoric, and that of other senior Russians who are now quite confident. There's a swagger about their demeanor these days. They're talking about victory. They're talking about gaining more of Ukraine. They're talking about the end of Ukraine as a state. That is their ultimate goal. However, alongside this, concerning position on the front lines, we are seeing around the periphery of the war some developments which are more encouraging for Ukraine. In the Black Sea, Ukraine has managed to essentially force the Russians to retreat. They've broken the blockade of the naval blockade of Ukraine's southern ports that Russia imposed at the very beginning of the war, and they've resumed maritime shipping, which has now returned to almost pre-war levels. So that's a major step for Ukraine. Ukraine's a big exporter, especially of agricultural products. So that's a big step on the economic front of the war. That really allows Ukraine to keep its head above water economically, which is crucial, of course. They forced the Russians to pull back from Crimea itself, which is the jewel in the crown of Putin's new Russian empire. They've sunk or damaged approximately a quarter of the entire Russian Black Sea fleet, including 2 ships in the last few weeks alone, two big warships. And they've done so using Ukrainian technologies, Ukrainian drone technologies. So the Battle of the Black Sea is really showing how Ukraine can achieve some pretty impressive goals. With a boldness, and also with a supply of Western weapons, which they've used also to attack Crimea and the naval bases, cruise missiles from France and Britain. Now, the other big development around the periphery of the war is in Russia itself. Ukraine has, in the last few months, launched a campaign of long-range bombing campaign using drones, that they've again domestically developed drones, to bomb Russia's oil and gas industry, the refineries. Now, Russia has dozens of major refineries all over the country. They're heavily concentrated in the west of Russia, so within range of long-range drone attacks. It's approximately, up to 1,000 kilometers. We've seen just last night, Ukraine hit targets that were over 1,200 kilometers from the Ukrainian border inside Russia. So Ukraine has developed some very interesting drone technologies that's allowing it to hit these targets. And because Russia is so big, and because the oil and gas industry in Russia is so large, and the refineries themselves are so big, it's very difficult for them to protect that. And Ukraine is essentially looking to undermine the war economy, Putin's war machine, by hitting the key engine of his economy. So these are interesting developments around the front lines. The final point I would make, I would think, is what we're seeing in Europe. We hear a lot about America, the deadlock there. That's a major concern, and it could be decisive for the war. But what we're seeing in Europe in recent weeks is really interesting, where Emmanuel Macron is basically standing up and saying, we've got to totally change the tone of our response to this. This is our war. We're not going to rule out sending troops to Ukraine. We've got to massively increase the support we provide for Ukraine, and we will not let Russia win this war. He's trying to consolidate the European countries around this idea. He's looking to increase the French support itself. And at the moment, it's rhetoric, because it's just begun, and they're just realizing we can't rely on America. Now, if in the next few months, Macron's rhetoric translates into serious concrete actions in terms of increased supplies to Ukraine, then that could have a big impact on the war. But at the moment, we don't know. I'm inclined to be skeptical because it's Europe, because it's France, because of the past history of their reluctance to take any major gambles or to become too involved in the war. But having said that, we've never heard this kind of rhetoric out of Paris before. So perhaps we should give them the benefit of the doubt, see where it goes. And certainly it's a potentially major shift in the war that could have a big impact. And the Russians don't like it at all. They're really upset about it, which is always a very encouraging sign. So let's see where it goes.
Peter, last question. You're not Ukrainian. Why the heck are you in Kyiv, Ukraine, in the middle of a war? Why?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, I came here as a young graduate over 20 years ago, and fell in love with the country. I was fascinated by the country. I was drawn into the people here, the history, the culture, but I think especially the people. Really, the incredible, the warmth of the people, the good humour, the intelligence, the resilience. It really struck me as a wonderful place, and also as an unknown place. There was a fascination that there was so much. It was such a sort of voyage of this personal discovery for me. And Kyiv, I should also stress, is a very, very attractive city. It's a very nice city to live in. It's a very appealing city. It's visually appealing. It's well laid out. It's a very enjoyable city to live in. It's got great restaurants and bars, and it's a lovely place to stroll around, and the people are extremely friendly. So there were a lot of personal motives in keeping me here, but I think that the historical narrative did appeal to me. I am a historian by education, by background, and the Ukrainian story just struck me as one of the great untold stories of European history. I'd be the first to admit I came here knowing nothing about Ukraine. And the more I learned, the more fascinated I became, and the more aware I became that I had not, that this had been basically shut off, that this history was totally unknown to the outside world. And that was also a big factor, I think, in this story that we've seen over the last 20 years since I've been here, 20 plus years, of Ukrainians on this sort of nation building journey. And as they've moved towards forward on this nation-building journey, we've seen increasing Russian aggression against them. The two things have gone in parallel. As Ukraine has grown stronger as a nation, more self-confident, more assured as a nation, and consolidated its statehood, Russia has become more and more aggressive in response to that process, and that has been an absolutely fascinating process to observe, and really very, very engaging. And again, I felt that's very compelling. I felt compelled to try and share that with international audiences if possible.
Well, we really appreciate you sharing it with us. Thank you so much, Peter Dickinson, Atlantic Council. Thank you very much. That's our show for tonight, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Good night, everybody.